When I was 18 years old, something happened to me in a school hall, a bit like this one. I was sitting my A-level English literature exam when I started to feel unwell. The symptoms were quite mild at first, a bit of breathlessness, sense of nausea, felt a bit dizzy. So I put my hand up and asked for some water. And taking small sips, I started to think, what was wrong? Had I not eaten enough? I thought. And then I remembered that I'd eaten all of my lunch at about 10 a.m. I'd also eaten my friend's lunch because she was too nervous to eat. Well, in which case, perhaps I'd eaten too much then. I looked at the question, and it was a dream. I'd even practiced a similar question the night before. It couldn't have been more easy. But I just couldn't shake the nausea. And that breathlessness was just getting worse. So this time, I put my hand up again, and I asked to leave. I could feel the eyes of all my classmates on me as I left that exam hall. Now, as you all know, news travels pretty fast at school. And no sooner had I been escorted outside of that exam hall than my English teacher was right there by my side, consoling me. It's okay. She kept saying, don't worry about it. You're not well. We'll just tell the exam board. It's fine. It's fine. But it was unfortunate timing, and she knew that, because my place at Oxford depended very much on getting an A in this subject. Now, much of that day is a blur, but the next thing I remember is being sat in the school medical bay with a thermometer in my mouth. My English teacher, still very much there. She hadn't gone. But now, the scariest teacher in the school stood lurking in the doorway. We'll call her Mrs. S. So, they read my temperature, and it's normal. Well, that surely can't be, given just how odd I was feeling. My heart was beating at such a pace. I thought I wouldn't be able to control it. Okay, but it comes back normal, and it's at this point that Mrs. S pipes up. Have you experienced panic attacks before? Well, not only had I never experienced a panic attack before, but I really had no clue what one was. In fact, I'll be really honest with you. I'd always just dismissed them. Thought they were something that wasn't really real. But what was happening to me in that moment could not have been more real. And it was then that Mrs. S explained to me exactly what a panic attack was, and that I was, in no uncertain terms, experiencing one. And she even had the humility to tell me that it was something that she too suffered from. Now, many parts of that day, are completely surreal to me. But perhaps the strangest moment of all was the realization that scary Mrs. S was a human being, and that she had weaknesses and vulnerabilities, and she was willing to share those with me. So, 5 hours later, and that's no exaggeration, 5 hours later, I went back into that exam hall, and I finished what I started. I should have felt really proud that I was able to do that, right? That after that ordeal, after 5 hours, I went back and I finished that exam. But I didn't. And for the longest time, I viewed what had happened to me that day with real shame. But where had that shame come from? because it certainly hadn't come from my teachers, particularly not Mrs. S, who, turns out, wasn't as scary and as unfeeling as we all thought. Ultimately, I think the shame stemmed from this one question that bounced around my head all summer, and I never shared it with anyone. How on earth was I going to cope at Oxford? How on earth was I going to cope with life if I had faltered under the pressure of an A-level? But when I got to university, my new friends shared similar stories: poor mental health, stress, anxiety, even panic attacks. And I admired that openness. I think it's why I chose them as friends. But I wasn't going to share similar stories of my own. So instead, I would sit there, nodding empathetically, and sometimes I might chip in and I might say, yes, I've heard a similar story that has happened to someone else, or something that I have read somewhere suggests a similar thing. But I never wanted to admit any similar feelings of shame or fear, because for me, to admit that would be to admit weakness. And that very admission would make me vulnerable. But in hindsight, I really wish I'd approached that situation differently. And here's why. Researcher and professor Brené Brown has spent 2 decades exploring ideas of courage, shame, and vulnerability. And she defines vulnerability as risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. Well, what on earth does that mean? In other words, it's that uncertain feeling we get when we start to loosen our control, when we go outside of our comfort zone. Now, in her TED Talk, Brené Brown argues that in an anxious world, and that we do live in very much an anxious world, we naturally cut ourselves off from things that make us feel vulnerable. We try to reduce that emotional exposure in any way, and that's exactly what I was doing when I went to university by not opening up, by not sharing how I felt. But what she argues is that although vulnerability is at the root of feelings of shame and anxiety, really horrible feelings, it's also the birthplace of creativity and joy. It's how we build meaningful connections. It's how we live wholeheartedly. And that rather than shutting ourselves off from these things, what we really should do is develop more openness and allow ourselves to feel vulnerable from time to time. So, in preparation for this talk, I was speaking to quite a few people, and I had a conversation with a male friend. And I spoke about Brené Brown and some of the things that she was saying about vulnerability and shame and mental health. And he nodded along quite knowingly and said to me, "Oh, she's speaking specifically about men, right?" Now, I was a little bit confused because to me, it seemed pretty obvious that she was speaking quite generally. But the more I thought about what he said, the more sense his comments made. Because the truth is, there are some forms of vulnerability that society doesn't really care about me showing. So, for example, I can say, with pretty much no shame, that I cried that day when I was 18. It's deemed healthy for me to explore my emotions. But my male friend might feel the pressure to appear strong. Strong very much being in inverted commas there. And these gender expectations do translate into some pretty grim realities. So men are far less likely to open up about how they feel. They are far less likely to seek help, and as a result, they are far more likely to suffer from poor mental health and addiction as a result. They are, quite shockingly, 3 times more likely to take their own life than their female counterpart. So, speaking to an audience of all boys, and as someone who works in an all-boys school, I feel that this story is a particularly important one to share. What I've learned is that vulnerability is simply an inevitable part of life. You cannot avoid it forever. And rather than shutting ourselves off from things that make us feel vulnerable, we should embrace it as an opportunity to learn, as an opportunity to be open and to build resilience. It is actually quite nerve-wracking to stand up here and talk to you all so openly and so publicly about a memory that I have buried for so many years. And just as I'm sure it was the case for Mrs. S, it makes me feel vulnerable. But I'm finally happy to embrace that. Thank you.